Short summary: Kristen Adams, long written off by an elite, judgmental family, secretly builds secure vision into a multi-billion-dollar cybersecurity company. She keeps her identity anonymous for years, living modestly while her relatives deride her as a failure. A Forbes cover revealing her as the secret billionaire founder is accidentally delivered during her parents' anniversary dinner. The revelation forces family reckonings. Shock, opportunism, revisionist pride, tentative apologies, and partial reconciliation. Kristen uses wealth to found a grant program, keeps independence, and cautiously rebuilds family ties on her terms. Narrative structure: beginning, conflict, climax, end. Beginning. Kristen arrives at parents' anniversary dinner, rehearsed to absorb insults, holding the secret of massive success. Conflict. Family ridicule escalates, especially Diana's public humiliation about food stamps. Kristen resists revealing herself until the Forbes copy arrives. Climax. The Forbes cover is presented. Stunned relatives scramble to reframe their history. Emotional confrontation ensues. Truth versus established narratives. End. Aftershock and slow recalibration. Kristen sets conditions, launches philanthropic work, refuses an acquisition that would compromise the mission, and accepts measured rapprochement. Emotional hooks and impactful moments that contrast. Modest Kristen versus opulent family setting, visual hook. The food stamp slight, visceral humiliation, and the fuel for revenge. The dramatic arrival of the Forbes magazine at the table, timed reveal. Kristen's calm, articulate confrontation, dignity instead of spectacle. The thaw, Diana's apology, and the nuanced, incomplete reconciliation. Elements that make the story go viral or relatable. Underdog tech founder hidden in plain sight. Resonates in the era of self-made billionaires and startup culture. Family drama plus public reveal equals high shareability. Themes of class, gender bias, and the tension between humility and self-worth. Satisfying payoff, the reveal, balanced with moral complexity, not just revenge. Weak points, cliches, repetition, lack of depth. Long exposition about family background becomes repetitive. Several scenes reiterate the same insults in different words. The coincidental, early magazine delivery is a bit contrived. It works dramatically, but risks feeling too neat. Diana's arc resolves a bit quickly. Apology lacks layered consequence. Suggestions for improvement: tone, structure, character work, tighten exposition. Show key history in compact flashbacks or single vivid images, e.g., office mattress, discarded Yale diploma. Make the magazine delivery feel anchored, e.g., a courier that recognizes James, or James's subtle complicity, to reduce coincidence. Give Diana a tangible moment of reckoning, an internal memory, or a private scene showing why she became so competitive. Emphasize Kristen's interior. Small rituals that reveal who she is, fixing a child's phone at brunch, teaching a student, so empathy extends beyond the reveal. Maintain ambiguity in reconciliation. People change slowly, resist tidy forgiveness. Ideal target audience: millennial and Gen Z viewers who love condensed, emotional reels and rich versus underdog narratives. Tech/entrepreneurship communities and women in STEM groups. Audiences who enjoy family drama, social status critiques, and feel-good but realistic vindication stories. Rewritten story, 6 sections, each 500 words. Section 1. New story beginning. 500 words approximate. The driveway split the night into 2 worlds. Manicured hedges, a row of perfectly trimmed boxwood under soft amber lamps, and a tired Toyota tucked behind 3 cars that gleamed with other people's certainty. Kristen Adams watched her reflection in the rear window, tugging the hem of a plain black blouse, the way people tug at memories to see whether they still fit. In a glass, she was exactly what she'd been trained to be: modest, unremarkable, an image her parents could explain with a single shrug. Perfect camouflage. A valet's footsteps thudded across stone. Through the front door came laughter like practice glass. The house smelled of roast and lemon polish. Portraits in ornate frames blinked down from the walls like jurors. Kristen held a small gift bag and the magazine in her mind, folded flat and hidden behind the edges of her plan. The Forbes piece was supposed to arrive tomorrow. Strategy, timing, modesty. A decade of choices had become a single chess move. Tonight, she'd sit under the chandelier her family had picked out together and breathe through the version of herself they wanted to believe. James, the butler, opened the door with a soft exhale. He had always been exception to the rule. One person at table level with her, someone who had seen both the underside of the polished life and the quieter hands that made it move. "Miss Adams," he said, and for a beat his eyes offered something less formal, a human recognition. She handed him a bottle. He read the label without a flicker of surprise, the way you do when you finally notice a small, honest thing. Inside, their world was soft with approval. Silk, compliments measured by tone, not truth. Eleanor, poised in navy, received the room's reverence like a currency. Robert spoke with the easy authority of an empire that taught itself how to listen only to advantage. Diana laughed in the cadence of someone whose life has been graded by an invisible rubric. Perfect pitch, perfect posture, perfect retort at the ready. The conversation orbited the usual satellites: donations, trusts, which child had scored which victory this season. Kristen took her place at the periphery and let the old script run. Deflected praise, small apologetic smiles, neutral replies tuned to the tempo of their approval. Under the table, she could feel the small scar inside her left palm. An imprint left from sleeping on an office mattress during a winter so hungry it taught her how to measure a day by coding sprints and stray coffee cups. She had been a Yale acceptance letter and a departure notice in the same breath. She had been the daughter who discovered a vulnerability in university's server and the woman who turned that discovery into a purpose that would not fit in a polite conversation. The scar was her anchor, not visible to them, but solid. As courses moved like clockwork, soup, then tenderloin, the insults arrived in patterns, gentle as trivia, sharp as a thrown shard. "Still renting?" someone asked. "Still living modestly?" Diana's voice always carried a double edge, warm enough to look like concern, cold enough to redefine failure. Kristen answered with practice calm. "How do you explain 10 years of quiet work to people who measure time by ribbons and degrees, not by root code and save logs?" She didn't. Let them speak. Let them label. In the quiet between dishes, she rehearsed a single sentence that had power in its simplicity. "I built something." When the servers cleared their hands and a hush settled like linen, James stepped forward with an envelope and a small apology under his breath. "Excuse the interruption," he said, but the words landed heavier than the cutlery. On the plate beside him was a courier's stamp and a copy of a magazine whose glossy face had stared back at her in photo shoots and drafts for months. The room leaned in like a wave. He turned the cover toward her slowly, as if unveiling a relic. The headline, short, indisputable, drifted across the polished wood and into the room. "Meet Tech's most secretive CEO." Silence was immediate, like the sound a plane makes before it shifts into descent. Kristen felt something lift, not triumphantly, but as if a lid had been removed from a long simmering pot. She lifted her eyes and met the faces she knew by pattern: shock, recalculation, a bewildered attempt at understanding. And at the far end, Diana's breath caught with the precise note of someone whose map of the world had just been erased. Kristen set her fork down gently. The beginning of the night, the beginning of the change, tasted oddly like mineral water and possibility. Section 2, build up, 500 words approximate. For 10 years, Kristen had been a ghost in two houses: the house of her family's expectations and the Glaston lab, where code and coffee build a world that couldn't be gestured into by polite conversation. Tonight, with that magazine lying between her and them like a lit match, the air carried something electric, less triumph than exposure. People don't always step into new truths gracefully. They shuffle, they gather evidence, they rewrite memory maps. Diana moved first, the way a conductor might reclaim tempo. Her voice tightened, anger at the sudden collapse of a hierarchy she thrived on, and everyone followed the cue. "Why didn't you tell us?" she demanded. Not only for information, but because the question was a way of reasserting a familiar script. "You hid, we judged, we were right." Kristen could have answered with a bluntness that would break plates. She chose instead the small, surgical truth that would cut clean without spectacle. Anonymity began as strategy, meritocracy in a field that wrote women into shapes they did not fit. Around the table, the reaction spun. Uncle Harold was amused and ready with a joke. Bradford's eyes flicked to balance sheets and networks. The guests turned their curiosity into currency. Questions about valuation, about exits, about the kind of money that moves like a new, polite language. Kristen answered with restraint, and when she spoke about the product, an AI that predicts attacks before they happen, the conversation shifted from social theater to utility. It's one thing to have $1 billion. It's another to describe how that fortune prevented a hospital's records from being stolen or how it kept a municipal water plant from going offline. Responses rearranged from envy to professional interest. Some people pivoted fast, eager to mate with success. But the moment wasn't about numbers for her. It was about the sliver that had been missing in every gathering. An honest question, one that asks what the work means rather than how it fills a ledger. Uncle Harold asked it without pretense. "What do you see when you look at a problem?" Kristen's voice softened. "When people treat technology as a gadget rather than as a public good, they don't see the harm." Her language turned to analogies, immune systems, pattern recognition, the ethics of prevention, and a different kind of attention arrived. Quiet, interested human. Eleanor's expression flickered like linen in wind. Confusion, then something that could be called hurt. That surprised Kristen. She had rehearsed anger, but not sorrow. "We only wanted what we thought was best," Eleanor said, and there was a tremor in the apology that had not existed before. It was an opening, small and unsteady. Kristen accepted it with neither triumph nor collapse, just recognition. For years, the family's care had been measured by calibration, schools, connections, prescribed paths. Love had been folded into prestige. That was a currency Kristen never cared to spend. Diana tried different tools: deflection, charm, accusation. "You must have enjoyed watching us worry," she said, which was less accusation and more defense. Kristen gave her a look that asked a different question. Did Diana ever imagine herself as someone who could be wrong? Diana's face shifted. A memory slid across it like film. A teenager handing her younger sister a crucifix of criticism because it was the quickest way to secure a seat in a future that promised safety. The memory was brief and vulnerable. It softened Diana for a moment. Then she bridged back to performance, the habit of armor snapping back into place. Outside, the garden lights haloed topiary like small moons. Inside, the family dynamics rearranged like chess pieces forced to confront an unfamiliar opponent. Kristen felt both vindicated and oddly tender. Vindication for the years of work, tenderness for how limited their map had been. She had chosen anonymity for reasons that mattered: safety and merit and the freedom to let her work have a voice without her gender shadow. Now, the reveal demanded new negotiation. What did respect look like after decades of dismissal? When the plate of dessert arrived, decadent and gilded, the social instruments resumed their quieter songs. Offers of help that sounded like entitlement, invitations that smelled of retroactive ownership, and the inevitable pivot toward networking. Kristen listened. She let the offers and apologies pass. Each one carried a test. Would she accept assistance that felt like recompense for past contempt, or would she choose boundaries that preserved the dignity of her earlier struggle? Later, alone in the powder room, Kristen touched the small scar on her palm again and thought of the students she mentored who did not know which doors they could open. The revelation tonight could become a tool. The magazine could be a mirror for her family and a ladder for the people who came after. She left the mirror with a clear decision. Power without purpose is vanity. Wealth without change is noise. Her expression hardened into the calm of someone charting the work ahead. When she returned to the dining room, Diana caught her eye across the table and mouthed, almost inaudibly, "I'm sorry." The words were thin but real, the first thread in a patch that would take time to weave. Kristen nodded. Not acceptance, not reconciliation exactly, just acknowledgement. That night the real business began, deciding, openly and quietly, who they would be now that truth had rearranged the room. Section 3. Midpoint twist, 500 words approximate. The courier's arrival felt like a stage cue, but the twist that followed was quieter and less theatrical. James returned from the entrance with a small stack of envelopes, and, tucked between them, a glossy photo sheet. Professional headshots staged behind glass labs and black backgrounds, their light catching the precise angles of a woman who'd spent her life fixing things no one valued. He set it down beside Kristen with the same care he used to place china. The room swallowed the sound like a collective intake. Diana's initial shock evolved into a physical searching, an attempt to locate the real Kristen behind the photocopied gaze. Her composure cracked into 1,000 micro-reactions. Bargaining eyes, a grip on the back of her chair, fingers closing around a fork as if it were an anchor. It was in that small crisis that the midpoint revealed itself. This evening was no longer merely a reveal of wealth. It had become an excavation of identity. Each family member had to decide whether to see Kristen as the child they had chastised or the person whose work had altered infrastructure. Someone at the table asked a practical question. If this is real, where did you begin? And the conversation pivoted from morality to origin story. Kristen offered fragments. A dorm room vulnerability she discovered, the sleepless months, the investors who laughed at her pitch until Catherine Mitchell took a chance. As she spoke, the room's focus narrowed. People don't engage with a myth the same way they engage with a process. When they heard terms like predictive AI and phrases about preventing attacks on hospital networks, the moral texture of the money shifted. It stopped being a trophy and started to read like labor. Diana, however, found a different response in herself. The question lodged: how long had she been defending a place in the world that felt most secure when someone else looked weaker? A flash of memory surfaced. Diana at 20, negotiating a summer internship with a professor who favored legacy ties, something in her jaw tightening as she clenched onto each advantage like a life raft. She realized her cruelty had been preemptive, a safeguard against her own fear of not being enough. The realization unmoored her. For the first time that night, she was not only defensive, she was unsettled. Bradford, sensing leverage, shifted his posture toward opportunity. "Have you considered partnerships?" he asked, his tone professional and immediate. He saw the evening differently, less about family dynamics and more about how new capital could refit old networks. That practicalness cut through emotion and dropped a cooler temperature into the room. Suddenly, everyone recalibrated their interest by who could help them now. The siblings' old scripts, the slights and the laughter, were being rewritten into new lines: alliance, access, advantage. There was a sudden interruption when Kristen's phone lit up with a cascade of messages. Editors, investors, reporters. The magazine had been pushed early. The digital edition was live. Her publicist's note flashed: digital live at midnight. Some subscribers receiving early copies. In a breath, the reveal multiplied beyond this dining room. News would soon roll through the social feeds, and Kristen felt the shift, private truth becoming public history. She felt neither elation nor dread, only a precise acceptance that movement had been initiated. But the real twist, what would alter the texture of their future, arrived not in the currency of headlines, but in a quieter, moral demand. Kristen announced, calmly and without fanfare, that she would not use this night to punish them. "I'm not here to humiliate," she said. "I'd rather change what was broken." She described, with surprising softness, a foundation she planned to endow: grants, mentors, networks for students from underrepresented backgrounds. Her voice steadied, and the room changed. Where previously people had seen domination in her withholding, now they perceived a purpose. She was channeling exposure into opportunity. This decision knocked at least two things loose at once. For some family members, it was discomforting. Kristen's revenge would not be petty. It would be institutional and enduring. For others, like Uncle Harold and a few cousins, it was inspiring. They leaned forward in curiosity and admiration. Diana's reaction was more complicated. She had anticipated a spectacle, an exultant reveal where Kristen would gloat and leave them abashed. Instead, Kristen offered agency and invitation, not vindication. That was harder to place in a world built on performances. Later, alone for a moment on the back terrace, Kristen inhaled cold air and let it clear the residue from her face. She had expected fireworks. Instead, she had dismantled a few assumptions and seeded something else, a moral claim to the power she now possessed. She wasn't content with being admired. She wanted to transform the conditions that made admiration optional and recognition rare. That was the real twist. Her intention transformed the reveal from a private triumph to a public mission. It was quieter than revenge, but more dangerous to the family's old order. When she returned inside, the electricity in the room had altered, less an outbreak of gossip and more a slow, uncertain negotiation. The rules had changed, and everyone around the table was trying on new roles. Section 4. Build to climax. 500 words approximate. The night edged into a new tempo. Conversation chopped into vignettes, plans, probes, recalibrations. Pressed between polite curiosity and opportunism, the family tried on different versions of themselves. The proud parents, the contrite sister, the strategic husband. None fit neatly. Kristen watched them like someone reading a script that needed rewriting. Diana retreated briefly, then returned with a different voice. One less performance, more repair. She asked a question that carried risk. Were there times you needed help, and we weren't there? The question hung like a fragile bridge. For a heartbeat, Kristen considered the ledger. The nights on office floors, the investors who closed their doors, the sting of public humiliations. Instead, she described a single dark winter. Ramen, long shifts, the pride that kept her from asking for charity. That image held for the table, the vulnerable center of an otherwise neat story. Eleanor's eyes glistened with something genuine for the first time that evening. I didn't know, she admitted, simple and stunned. The admission displaced some of the shame off Kristen's shoulders. But confessions do not erase patterns. They reveal them. Kristen's next move was surgical. She named the pattern. You asked whether I'd had help. I did, just not from this table, she said. She drew breath and outlined Catherine Mitchell's pivotal early investment, the small team that believed, the first client who gave them a chance. She described, not for show, but to make the point, the work they did to stop attacks that could have erased a community's trust in institutions. At that, Bradford pivoted again to numbers. He proposed a celebratory piecing in, family foundations, joint philanthropic efforts. It should have been a bomb, but it felt opportunistic, as if they wanted to affiliate themselves to her mission by proximity. Kristen felt the old itch, being used as a status token. She shut down gently. My foundation will have strict conflict of interest guidelines, she said. It will be led by community leaders and technologists who don't answer to family ties. The rebuke wasn't shouted, yet it landed like a law. Uncle Harold, who had been a pragmatic witness, spoke up differently. We were all wrong about the way we assumed things, he said, which was neither full apology nor dismissal, but the kind of honest note Kristen had been waiting to hear. Some of the circle softened. Others circled like wary birds that had lost a perch. The night's moral weather became unstable. The pressure continued when a reporter's call came through. Questions about the company's valuation and impending consumer product launch. Kristen excused herself and took the call. Her voice over the phone was businesslike, crisp. She handled the queries with the same steadiness she used in C-suite rooms. Firm, precise, disclosing what mattered and holding close what shouldn't be public. After the call, she re-entered the dining room, carrying the residual of two worlds, the private family realm and the public stage where her decisions would ripple. There followed a private moment between Kristen and her father. He had retreated from his initial shock into a mode she recognized, calculation. He asked how to be part of her life now, what role the family should have. It was the same question she had asked in reverse all these years. What did they want from her beyond proof? Kristen considered it honestly. She wanted their respect, not access to her capital. She asked him for meaningful curiosity, questions about the harm her work prevented, about why she had kept anonymity, and then she asked for boundaries. "I'm willing to have you in my life," she said, "but not as controllers of my mission." He listened, and the expression in his face shifted in small increments toward something like reconciliation. As the room thinned and guests prepared to leave, Diana caught Kristen's arm for a moment in the hallway. The apology she gave was murky, part regret, part strategy, but there was a tenderness beneath the surface. "I don't want to lose my kid's sister to the headlines," she said, the sentence clumsy with honest fear. Kristen answered with the same care she applied to code. Precise, quiet, protective of the structure they'd once shared. "I'm not your trophy, Dee," she said, "and I won't be someone you rewrite." By the end of the evening, the family's immediate appetite for proximity had emerged. Some wanted it for the new access, some for repair. The center of the table had shifted. Kristen had become the axis, and everyone would now orient themselves around her orbit. But she kept the steering wheel. Her boundary setting was firm. No financial leverage by relatives. The foundation would be independent. Her company would stay privately mission-focused for now. She also set personal terms. Weekend visits on her schedule, no unsolicited career advice, and first, the offer to mentor their children as a gesture of true inclusion rather than performance. She left the house not triumphant but calibrated, clearer than when she'd arrived. The reveal had done what she had intended. It had fractured old certainties and demanded that people act or pause with new information. The climax hadn't happened yet. Tonight had layered the stakes. Her wealth had opened doors, but also exposed the fragility of relationships when value gets discovered. Ahead lay a decisive moment. An ultimatum of sorts, not in money, but in terms. Would her family change beyond the optics, or were they simply rebranding to claim association? The answer would come, not with headlines, but with persistent, ordinary decisions. Section 5, Climax, 500 words approximate. The real test arrived, not in a shouting match, but in a quiet, unexpected way. A family meeting called 3 days after the dinner, ostensibly to discuss feelings, but actually to negotiate roles. Kristen agreed to attend with terms, a time limit, an agenda, and the request that each person speak without interruption. The room at her parents' house smelled less like performance and more like pressure. Eleanor opened with a trembling voice. "We feel guilty," she said simply, which was less an accusation than a confession. She described small, private moments of uncertainty, calls that went unanswered, Christmas gifts misdirected, and finally, a realization that their version of care had been heavy with expectation. Kristen listened, measuring tone for sincerity. Words are cheap. Actions are the currency that follows. Diana's turn came like a held breath released. She said she had been ashamed of not being completely secure and had projected that fear onto Kristen. The confession was rawer than Kristen expected. There were tears that weren't theatrical, but true. "I thought I was protecting you," Diana said. "Instead, I think I was protecting myself." That sentence landed with the force of a small explosion. It revealed motive, vulnerability, and the potential for a new map. For the first time, Diana's story wasn't a set of barbs, but a responsible vulnerability. Then the moment shifted. Bradford presented a memorandum, without malice but with a lawyer's efficiency, offering to coordinate public relations and to help structure family philanthropy. It was not a cruelty. It was the old pattern reassembling itself in a different costume. Kristen felt the old needle prick. Come closer, be useful, be owned. She responded with the clarity she had cultivated in the boardroom. "I appreciate the offer," she said, "but if you want to help, sign the foundation's guidelines. No family-linked grants. No advisory seats for relatives. It's about accountability, not appearances." Their faces registered confusion, then resistance. This was not the emotional payoff they had imagined. They wanted proximity with benefits, the social glow of association. Instead, Kristen demanded structural ethics. She had not come for theatrics. She had come to change the rules. The climax reached its peak when Diana asked the question that had tormented Kristen for years. "Did you do this to punish us?" The room felt colder. Kristen thought about the years of humiliation, about the nights when the world felt impossibly small. She could have said yes and watched reputations burn. She could have said no and dissolved the arc into grace. She chose a third path, wider, more complicated. "I did it to prove to myself I could," she said. "I did not do it to punish. I did it because there are people who won't be heard unless they're made visible." Her voice steadied. "But I will not be complicit in re-establishing systems that once excluded me." That answer reframed the conflict. It stripped the reveal of mere revenge and recast it as stewardship. Kristen was making an ethical claim. Wealth without accountability is self-serving. Power without purpose is empty. She then announced a firm decision. Secure Vision would remain independent. The foundation would be led by a board with lived experience of marginalization and separate governance. The room reacted. Some were relieved. No immediate redistribution of wealth to solve their anxieties. Others were affronted. This was not the post-reveal feast they'd imagined. It was a governance meeting. Yet beneath the surface, something shifted. The family who had once relied on shared symbols of status now faced the reality of institutional process. It required them to engage in the bureaucratic, ordinary work of change. Diana stepped forward then, quieter now, and offered a different kind of gift, an honest commitment to introspection. "I will go to therapy," she said, an odd, intimate promise for someone who had used control as armor. It wasn't grand, but it mattered. It meant change would take labor, not announcements. When Kristen stood to leave, the air had been reallocated. Their dynamic now had rules, boundaries, governance, and the possibility of incremental repair. Kristen walked out into the night with that same small scar in her palm. Only now it felt less like proof of hunger and more like the mark of someone who had learned to build durable things. The climax wasn't a single dramatic event. It was the moment when power and principle found a framework and demanded follow-through. That was the hardest, bravest thing, not to win, but to insist that winning be meaningful. Section 6. Ending. 500 words approximate. 3 months later, Kristen sat in a conference room that looked out over rain-streaked Seattle and a skyline that seemed, for once, like an honest horizon. The Foundation's acceptance portal had gone live. There were applications streaming in from cities and towns she barely knew existed. The first cohort of mints reflected a range of backgrounds she'd seen in nameless hopefuls outside community centers and in the hands of students who fixed their families' busted routers for pocket money. Her phone buzzed with messages, some institutional asks, some tentative family texts. Eleanor had RSVP'd for the inaugural Foundation event. Diana had sent a document with notes titled, "How I Can Help." There was a new rhythm to contact now, less demand, more dialogue. At a small table near the window, Kristen took a call from a program director at a community college she supported. They spoke about curriculum and internships and a plan to let students run real-world security exercises. The words felt like bricks. She thought of the years she'd spent in near silence, coding in a basement, and of the students who deserved time indoors instead of judgment. This was how she wanted her fortune to behave: active, iterative, and accountable. Her father, who once measured her worth by Ivy League credentials, called later that week to ask a real question about risk management. Not to manage her, but because she believed he wanted to learn. She answered not as a confrontational child, but as a colleague who could outline principles and invite discussion. It did not erase the past, but it created a space where past grievances could meet mutual curiosity. Diana and Kristen began meeting, slowly, awkwardly. They had no illusions of a fairy tale reconciliation. Diane's apology had not been a clean erasure of hurt. It was the opening of a long project. They spoke frankly about competitiveness, fear, and the small betrayals that compound over decades. Kristen listened, setting boundaries. no rewriting of history, no capitalization on her identity without explicit consent, and shared commitments to keep their children's access to mentorship genuine rather than performative. At the community college, Kristen watched a tall, shy student debug a distributed attack simulation with focused joy. Afterward, the student hugged her clumsily, whispering thanks that felt like a public epiphany. Kristen thought of the contrast of a boardroom and a dining room, and realized the latter had sharpened the former. She had wanted that reveal to matter beyond the dinner table. The foundation was the answer. Secure Vision remained independent. The $18 billion acquisition offer had been declined. Principle over easy exit. It was a gamble that made some on the board nervous, but aligned with Kristen's belief that security is a right, not a brand. Her decision drew nods at conferences and headlines that treated her seriousness as her defining feature rather than her bank account. She felt the attention, but it no longer defined her. One Sunday brunch 2 months after the meeting, Kristen walked into her parents' house with a ceramic pie dish and a plate of small, plain biscotti she'd learned to bake during sleepless product launches. The table was different, less gilded, more conversation forward. They spoke of ordinary things: who would host a kid's birthday, which mentor was being paired with a student, small gestures of reknit ties. There were no guarantees. There was only willingness. At night, she returned to her modest home, unlocked the door, and glanced at the shelf where a single framed photo hung. A younger Kristen in a cluttered office, hair unkempt, eyes sleepless, smiling at a whiteboard full of impossible lines. The picture reminded her that the public reveal had been a step. The real work was quieter and slower. She sent Diana a link to a lecture on mentorship for girls in STEM. Diana replied with a short message. Read. Thoughtful. Proud, in a different way. Kristen smiled. Pride, she'd learned, could be earned through action rather than assigned by pedigree. The Forbes headline grew stale in the social feed, replaced by stories about product launches and grants awarded. That was precisely the point. The satisfaction she felt no longer came from proving wrong those who underestimated her. It came from seeing small, sustained change ripple forward. Students gaining internships, hospitals breathing easier because attacks were prevented, a family finding new language for respect. As rain washed the city lights into long streaks, Kristen turned off the lamp and slept without the old ache of needing their approval. She had wanted them to see her. She had wanted much more, to make a difference that would last. In the quiet that followed, she felt something steady and true. The work continued, and that was enough.